Welcome everybody to the rapid fire panel discussion. There'll be 3 speakers speaking on different topics today. My name is Gary Bassi. I'm the Director of Medical Device Reprocessing at Support Services, Mount Sinai Hospital, Toronto, Canada. Learning objectives of the rapid fire discussion are as follows. Discussing the COVID-19 alcohol-based hand sanitizer refill procedures, exploring the COVID-19 N95 sterile processing and cleaning verifications, and examining how to effectively reprocess PPE. The first topic is tackling the alcohol-based hand rub crisis during COVID-19. So during the COVID pandemic, we had numerous supply chain issues. We've seen a number of PPE go on back order and be constrained in terms of its supply, including N95 masks, gloves, gowns, disinfectant wipes, and alcohol-based hand rub. Alcohol-based hand rub turned out to be very problematic, also known as ABHR. They are unique systems and non-standardized approaches within each organization for product and volume/size. They had implications in terms of the active ingredient used in different settings, and we'll explain a little bit about that in a minute. Alcohol became in high demand and short supply. So immediately we had to start looking at what the alternatives were. At that time, a lot of institutions started exploring technical grade alcohol. Health Canada particularly issued a warning around technical grade alcohol and its use in certain settings, such as fetal centers. So what are the risks of it? So as you can see here on this picture, I was able to get a quick snippet of a pictogram that I seen from cdc.gov where a number of methanol poisoning was caused, which caused blindness and other fatal issues by certain people's ingesting ethanol or methanol for that purpose. We're using methanol as a hand sanitizer. So it's not that you can just quickly substitute your hand sanitizer that may have isopropyl alcohol or ethanol in there with anything. You need to be careful that you don't use any sanitizer that contains methanol, and ingesting it can be very dangerous. So there's certain risks when looking at alternative substitute processes in a crisis situation. So the other problem that arose was that there's proprietary technology in terms of dispensing these alcohol-based hand sanitizer rubs. So every vendor seems to have its own unique system that dispenses, which presented itself a problem because if there was a supply of alcohol-based hand sanitizer available, it now means that we have to change the dispensers because they can't take just any bottle. So the vendor's proprietary systems rely on their own proprietary alcohol bottle. We ran into a situation where we did have a proprietary system. We did have 2 or 3 different proprietary systems in our hospital that delivered alcohol-based hand sanitizer through a pump or a lever-controlled push mechanism. And we had to develop a system where we were able to refill our own alcohol bottles because moving to a different alcohol bottle simply wasn't feasible with the types of dispensers we had. Not only that, but at that time, a lot of companies were manufacturing alcohol bottles, but did not have the dispensers to go with them. So we developed an aseptic technique where we were able to collect the bottles that were used at the units and within the hospital, prepare the bottles by cleaning and disinfecting them, refilling them using an aseptic technique, closing the bottles, packaging them, labeling them, and then distributing them back for reuse. We set up a workstation. The first station was to prepare the bottle, where it had our disinfectant wipes, empty bottles, and medical grade air to reinflate the bottle after it had been depressed. And then the middle station allowed us to have our antimicrobial hand solution refill bottles, i.e. the refill hand sanitizer solution, sterile trays to hold the different components of the bottle that we removed to fill it, and then a peristaltic pump with sterile tubing set, and some empty bottles to fill. Packing station included totes and filled bottles with a sticker gun and labels to label them. And of course, a fire extinguisher knowing that we're dealing with large volumes of alcohol and a nearby sink. Also, spill kits and absorbent pads to allow for the safety measures that we need to take place. So this is the picture at the bottom, shows you what that looks like in real pictures. So the collection process involved placing bins around the hospital labeled for staff to drop their empty hand sanitizer bottles in, particularly the housekeeping staff that were responsible for changing them. And the inspection and cleaning involved inspecting the bottle to make sure it's not cracked. If it was cracked, it was disposed of, wiping the bottle down with a disinfectant wipe, removing the plunger from the bottle, inspecting the gasket. If the gasket was damaged or broken, the bottle was discarded. Because we had different proprietary systems, some bottles involved removing a little ball valve at the top of the bottle where they didn't have a plunger. And I'll show you that in a minute. And then packaging, simply what we talk about was the label gun, where we were able to stamp the expiry date, the refill date, the lot number that came from the refill bottle itself, and then removing the label and labeling it with the ingredients and contents of the hand sanitizer solution we had procured to refill into our existing bottles. Again, important for the end users to know what they're putting on their hands. So that's how it looked like, and that's how we stamped the bottles on the top with the refill dates. And this is how the accepted technique looked. So as I mentioned, we disinfected the bottle. If it had a plunger, we removed the plunger. At the bottom of the plunger was a little ball valve we used to remove aseptically with sterile forceps. The ball was placed in a sterile dish. The forceps were placed back in a sterile dish. And then we used medical grade air to reinflate the bladder of the bottle. We used a peristaltic pump with sterile tubing that had been sterilized and a sterile insufflation disposable needle to suck the solution out of refill solution and inject it through the insufflation needle into the bladder we were trying to refill. Now, the insufflation needle was important because it controlled the flow so that you're able to fill it in a slow manner without it foaming. And this is how the setup looked like. So when it was running on the far picture on the right there. So it was then packaged, plunger and everything placed back on with the respective labels. And as you can see, elastic band with a label attached to the bottle, which was when it was delivered to the unit. The dispenser itself that was branded with a different vendor's name was also relabeled on top so that the end user knows in this pandemic that you're not using the branded alcohol here that was previously in this dispenser. It's actually the refill solution that we've placed in here. So there's full transparency across the system. This allowed us to be able to procure large amounts of alcohol with the supply chain constraints that we had, and continue allowing our frontline personnel to be able to sanitize their hands, reducing infection rates, and allowing us to use our dispensers and systems that were already set up in the hospital, but by still providing alcohol to those frontline users. So we created a sterile tray which had the trays, the forceps, the sterile tubing that we would sterilize at the end of each refill session. So every time the following day a new refill session was started, it started off with a sterile tray that had been sterilized to prevent any further cross-contamination. Thank you for your time today and listening into this rapid fire session, and I'll now hand it over to the next speaker.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jacqueline Daly, and I am the Senior Manager for Infection Prevention at Providence Mission Hospital in Mission Viejo, California. Today, I want to present for you a scenario that we were faced with at my healthcare facility, and that was, you want me to do what with the N95 respirator mask? And that was what I got when I approached my sterile processing department around reprocessing the N95 and the issues that we had with supplies in this ongoing, never-ending SARS-CoV pandemic. Pandemics are not new. They have been known to be out there many years. various organisms. We had the Black Death, the bubonic plague, we had smallpox, the Spanish flu. But when we look at this graphic on the left, we know that pandemics occur. So how did we end up where we did at the start of the pandemic? If we knew that pandemics happened, how did we get here? How were we caught so off guard and unprepared? And how is it that we ended up having to use strategies to manage personal protective equipment, or PPE? The CDC has been there for healthcare facilities, the public, through this entire pandemic, constantly updating us and helping us to maneuver through the pandemic, helping us how to maneuver through the supply issues around personal protective equipment. They outlined for us how we could look at our capabilities by breaking out PPE based on whether it's conventional strategies, things that we would generally do for infection prevention in healthcare setting on a regular basis, and contingency strategies that could be used during periods where we anticipate that we could have shortages of personal protective equipment, and crisis capacity, which are those that take us out of the normal standards of care, strategies that we could use when supplies cannot meet the facility's current or anticipated PPE utilization rates, which is where we were very soon in the pandemic. And in spite of following all the items that you see there under the graphic, like selectively canceling places in that contingency, trying to decrease length of stay for medically stable patients, and when we hit the crisis capacity, canceling all elective and non-urgent procedures and appointments, we still were left with not enough N95 respirators. So then we ended up with, again, terminology such as extended use and limited reuse, where we would wear the same PPE, including N95s, for repeated encounters with several patients without removing the PPE between the encounters. We did this for situations where multiple patients were infected with the same pathogen, aka COVID, and patients are placed together in dedicated spaces, meaning they are cohorted into the same area. And it was a recommended option for conserving PPE, not just N95, but other things as well, like gowns and so forth. With the limited reuse, the practice of using the same PPE for multiple encounters with patients, but removing it or doffing it after each encounter. So dependent on where your facility was on the spectrum between conventional and crisis capacity, you may have found yourself implementing either an extended use or a limited reuse based on where you were. So when we brought this forth to our healthcare workers, you can bet this did not go over well initially. You want to reprocess used N95 respirators repeatedly? Well, how do you plan on cleaning them? So that kind of, on top of everything else, the healthcare workers became very skeptical and their trust became on an uneven keel. How do you clean it? How is it going to be sterile if you don't clean it? What are you going to be using to do this process? What are going to be health and safety concerns? How do I know I'm getting my own N95 respirator back? Well, you know what? I don't know. I'll just keep using it till I can't. And if you want me to reuse it, where am I supposed to put it? And how long is this going to go on for? And what quality controls are in place? And we explain to our healthcare workers that this is under an emergency use authorization through the FDA. This is not something that we would do normally. We are in crisis right now with the respirators, and they understood that. And rightly so that they should be asking those questions. I would ask those questions. I ask those questions. So there was a storage dilemma. Okay, we're going to reuse these. Where are we going to put them? Can we use plastic bag or paper bags? The recommendation was to use paper bag or somewhere where we could get flow of air around it so the mask could dry. We educated and observed and instructed how to remove the respirators to avoid contamination, how to store them, what to do with them when they're having lunch, when they're on their breaks, how to put them back on for the remainder of the shift without contaminating themselves, how to store a disinfected N95 in the case of future shortages, and how to go about continually disinfecting. How often should they be disinfected, and how often should they be reused? So again, I am hoping that we never get to this stage again, especially now where we're seeing a resurgence of the virus, not the wild type so much, but as the variant. Then there were the issues with the SPD. There was the logistics. How are we going to implement this? And again, this required a multidisciplinary team. It wasn't just a one-person thing. We had to look at the competencies around the technician. I think we went above and beyond. The staffing issues, how are we going to collect? How are we going to process them? How are we going to communicate this? How are we going to manage expectations? How are we going to manage the respirator? What about the integrity? People wear makeup and there's lotions and other things. How are we going to monitor? How are we going to distribute? What are we going to do about storage? Is this going to be once a day, once a week? How are we going to logistically manage collection and redistribution? And that's where the question came from, our sterile processing. You want to do what and when? So eventually we got them on board. We discussed the research that was out there and discussed the emergency use authorization. We looked at the instructions that came along with the reprocessing. We looked at the manufacturer's documentation, because the manufacturers at the same time were doing some limited testing around reprocessing of the N95 respirators and what the integrity of the respirators would be pre and post reprocessing, and making sure that we were constantly communicating and educating and following the guidelines as regulation as much as possible and as much as you can with the instructions from the manufacturers of these respirators. And at the same time, we had our healthcare workers bringing in their own respirators and dealing also with OSHA. And I'm in California and we have Cal OSHA as well. So they were providing guidelines as well and regulations around what needed to be done to protect our healthcare workers and the patients that were in-house. Well, we went ahead and did this, part one. We had the emergency use authorization. We studied it. We looked at what that meant. We looked at the criteria and the instructions. We would not reprocess damaged endoscope, the number of times that it would be reprocessed, the monitoring, and we were using vaporized hydrogen peroxide to do this. So we had the monitors, the BIs, and internal chemical indicators. At the same time, in the state, they also had areas where you could send your respirators for reprocessing if you chose not to do them on site. We had tracking logs and for the usage, the location, the unit, and we had the healthcare workers put their name in a way that would not damage the respirator. We mapped out the work. We added on caregivers or healthcare workers to work on weekends, and they were dedicated just to this process. And we did audits and feedback to the healthcare workers because we had extraordinary high volumes of N95 respirator to reprocess. Then we started having issues around staffing and workflow, so we had to adjust. And that's the whole point of this. You need to keep looking at the process. And healthcare workers and providers were requested to assist by pre-packaging the N95 in our paper plastic pouches that had a chemical internal indicator inside. And then we would just pick them up and seal them and put them through the process and then deliver them back. And that resulted in some cost savings around doing that. And we discontinued the process when supplies became more readily available. And now with the surge, we are better prepared to managing the need for those N95 respirator masks. And we'll go on to the next presenter.
Well, hello everyone. And I'm the third contributor to this rapid fire discussion forum. My name's Brian Kirk. I'm the director of Brian Kirk Sterilisation Consultancy Group Limited based in the UK. The title of my section is Developing Guidance for Reprocessing Single-Use PPE, a UK perspective. Well, the driving force behind what I'm about to describe was essentially driven by the fact that at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, PPE was obviously a vital means of preventing transmission from patient to healthcare worker, but sadly insufficient PPE was available in the supply chain. And this wasn't really anybody's, I won't say that it was anybody's fault. You could argue that maybe our various governments didn't have enough foresight or the supply chain couldn't respond quickly enough. But the fact of the matter is healthcare workers were being asked to treat and support extremely infectious patients without any protection to themselves. So as a result of this shortfall in PPE, many authorities began to consider if single-use PPE could be disinfected and reused. And so this short talk outlines the development of guidance, which I was involved in as part of my membership of the Institute of Healthcare Engineering and Estate Management. So the whole project began when it was announced and we learned that the FDA had given emergency use authorization to 2 sterilizer manufacturers for reprocessing large disinfection of single-use N95 respirator masks. And these 2 technologies were based on vaporized hydrogen peroxide, the way the ASP Sterad and the Steris V-Pro, which are commonly found in many sterile service departments. And so as a result of this, we decided within IHEM to develop a relatively short guidance on how such machines could be used and some of the considerations that needed to be made before going down the process of decontaminating N95 masks. So the first consideration was the regulatory considerations. Many SSDs in the UK are registered as medical device manufacturers according to the European Medical Device Directives. And these are therefore audited by the notified bodies, and they are controlled by the UK MHRA, which is the regulatory body for medical devices in the UK. Now, the reprocessing of single-use medical devices is forbidden within the UK NHS. And the other factor is PPE is not categorised as a medical device, and therefore it falls outside of the scope of the MDR. So PPE requirements are usually regulated in the UK by the Health and Safety Executive rather than medical device regulatory bodies. So the implications of an FSD agreeing to reprocess contaminated PPE, in particular respirators, would need to be carefully considered because of the possibility of disruption to the normal flow within an SPD department. So if you look at this diagram, you can see the typical cyclical process flow for reusable instruments. So you have dirty in, which goes straight into a cleaning, disinfection and inspection process, followed by packaging and sterilisation, and then a clean and sterile out, which then goes off to the end user. Now, what we would be proposing is bringing contaminated PPE, highly infectious PPE, in at the very latter stages of this process, which is essentially where the clean instruments are being handled in readiness for packaging and sterilisation. So that was an immediate problem that any SSD would need to consider. Can we really afford to bring contaminated items in at the latter stage of the reprocessing cycle? The next issue was technical considerations. In general, PPE, and in particular respirators, are single-use items, and there are a number of implications which must be considered should you decide to reprocess them. The first one, which we consider, is material compatibility. Obviously, hydrogen peroxide vapor is quite a corrosive material, and it could degrade the materials of the filtration masks. The next issue is respirator fit. Reprocessing could damage the shape, fit and elasticated attachments of respirators, and that would then remove the capability to retain fit seals on the end users. The next consideration was filtration efficacy, and obviously reprocessing could damage the materials of the respirator, and in particular the structure and electrostatic attraction properties of the filtration system, making it less effective. The fourth consideration could be physical damage, and this might mean that as the filtration mask is removed by the user, you could end up with small holes or damage to the device, which would then make it unusable the second time round. Hydrogen peroxide residuals are a major concern because obviously if there were any residuals inside the filtration mask, then the wearer would be breathing those straight into the lungs, and as we mentioned before, hydrogen peroxide can be quite corrosive. And then of course probably the biggest consideration is how effective can we achieve viral inactivation. Now, after use, a respirator may contain coronavirus contamination, and this might be embedded within a matrix of spittle and sputum. The salts from perspiration of the wearer are likely to be present, dried on salts, and it is known that such biocontamination can protect against viral inactivation by a variety of disinfecting agents. So any validation study establishing the effectiveness must consider that the viral particles would be embedded in a complex biomatrix. So personal hygiene is a consideration. Respirators cannot be cleaned, as this may affect the respirator fit. So the proposed disinfection process would need to make sure that it was possible to track individual filter masks with individual wearers so that they went back to that individual at the end of the decontamination process. So the conclusions were that lack of PPE for frontline healthcare workers was possibly a major contributor to transmission of COVID-19 from patient to healthcare worker. The lack of PPE supply meant means were sought to enable single-use PPE could be reprocessed. And as I've identified, many factors needed to be considered when developing such processes. And hopefully I've outlined some of those considerations in this presentation. So on that note, I'll thank you all for participating in our quickfire session, and I'll now open the floor for comments and questions. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for listening into the panel presentation, the rapid fire education session. We're now going to be starting the question and answer process. So we have the first question here. Okay, we are still in a crisis capacity of our 45-inch and 54-inch wrap, yet the vendor reps are still coming in to audit their sets, which are fully processed. Therefore, the used wrap is getting thrown away, and then the sets are immediately reprocessed again. Also, elective surgeries are still being done at the hospital while we are in a crisis capacity of this global sterilization wrap shortage. Yet vendor reps are still coming in to audit their sets, which are fully at the height of the pandemic and throughout the following months. There may be monetary components that need to be considered of running a hospital and keeping people employed, but other considerations should be looked at. So I can comment before I pass it over to Jackie to comment that there are numerous there are numerous strategies that we're looking at in Canada to be able to ramp back our volumes right back up. And some of those include extended hours, working different days, performing surgeries at different centers outside the hospital. And in terms of global sterilization shortage on the sterilization wrap, we are lucky in that aspect, certainly at my facility, because we use the laundered linen wrap, so we were not impacted by that. However, we do use a small percentage of sterilization wrap for low temperature items, but we were able to successfully convert those over and containerize those items, so we were not impacted by the sterilization wrap.
And as for in my area in the United States, in California, the majority of the hospitals canceled all elective surgeries during the crisis portion of the pandemic. And so we were only looking at urgent emergent cases. And so that resulted in us having to reutilize our staff, other parts of the hospital facility. We still had our SPD department still functioning, but what we were doing mostly, we've converted a lot, as Gary said, to containerized systems. And so we weren't having as much of an issue, but we were fully aware that there were issues around the wraps that were available. But because of the cancellation of elective procedures, we were able to carry on. So in a crisis setting, I think it's important to look at the volumes, and you can't do this in isolation. You should be collaborating with multiple individuals in the organization to determine what you can and cannot do and what the financial implications are. But I think in the end, with the pandemic still ongoing, it behooves us all to develop plans to address what would happen if this pandemic goes on for the extended period of time, which I expect it will, to address. So right now, my particular healthcare facility and those in my hospital system are pretty much out of crisis and are back to conventional strategies. But because we are using those containerized systems, we're doing fairly well, I would say. Dr. Kirk, any comments?
Yeah, thank you. In the UK, we're in a slightly different position because we're now seeing the impact of the very successful vaccination program here, in that whilst case rates are quite high and still increasing, the number of hospitalizations are remaining relatively low. So our healthcare system is now beginning to catch up, or try to catch up, with the elective surgeries that had to be suspended during the previous 18 months. So there is a hope that the people who needed surgery but couldn't have it will now get it. But it is going to be a long process, probably 12 months or 18 months before they have caught up with the lists and are then able to re-establish some level of normality. But as I say, with the decreasing number of hospitalizations due to COVID, it is relieving the pressure a little bit from the point of view of restarting elective surgery.
If I may add to that as well, we're seeing right now, back to quote unquote normal, we've seen a rather large increase back to normal volumes actually in our operating rooms and in our inpatient admissions. But one of the things that we're doing is pre-surgical testing. And if the patients test positive, then they are not put on the surgery schedule for about 30 days. So that has helped with the volume of patients that comes through that pre-surgery, pre-procedure testing, which is still ongoing as of this time.
Yeah, if I could just add to that, yeah, that's absolutely correct. Well, many of the hospitals here are still exercising rigorous COVID measures to prevent people gaining access to the hospital with COVID. People who are waiting for elective surgery, once they get their invitation to attend the hospital, they are asked to self-isolate for 10-day periods before they actually go into the hospital, to try and reduce any risk of them catching COVID or carrying it with them into the hospital. So although hospitalizations are falling, the hospitals are taking very strict measures on trying to control the entry of COVID into the hospitals.
Well, right now at my facility, we are seeing a lot of unvaccinated patients being admitted. Our ICUs are becoming full again. But as for the surgery, I think we're still good with the surgical procedures, and we have not seen a strain being placed on our sterile processing department. So in that regard, I consider us fairly lucky, but the vaccine strategy to reduce the admissions would certainly be of help, because currently our vaccine compliance across the country is waning. Where we ramped up fairly hard and fast, we are now seeing a drop off of vaccinations happening. So many initiatives are being put into place to entice individuals to get their vaccine. Some are monetary, some are, others, things that they offer, free entry into baseball stadiums and so forth. So yeah, but from a healthcare facility, I'm hoping that we don't go back to where we were the late 2020, early 2021, where we had dramatic surges and a rapid incline or rapid rise in patient deaths. So yeah, that's still.
All right, we have another question here. I think this one's for myself in regards to, did you consider outsourcing the alcohol refill solution that you came up with, and what was your rationale behind keeping it in-house? So at the time of the pandemic, there was third-party companies who approached various facilities offering their services to collect their hand sanitizer bottles and refill them off-site and deliver them back. We did look at their processes. However, our rationale for keeping it in-house was that, one, we had a department that was certified in handling medical devices, certified medical device reprocessing technicians that were educated and trained and were used to with the day-to-day handling on how to employ aseptic technique. That was one of the reasons. Two, we felt that we had on-site sterilization equipment and facilities that could lend us a help in keeping the tubing and aspiration needles that we used to be sterilized frequently to prevent cross-contamination. And three, our quality systems in MDR in terms of our water systems used to clean or disinfect any of these containers were at a higher level than any of the third-party vendors in terms of our filtration to produce the pure water that we use in MDR. So based on those considerations, we decided to keep it in-house. Over to you, Brian. I think there may be a question for you.
Sorry, I was muted. One of the points that I raised in the presentation has been commented on is the concerns of introducing contaminated PPE at an intermediate stage in the reprocessing cycle. As we all know, the reprocessing of reusable medical devices goes through a cyclical process, and dirty instruments come in at one end of that process and sterile instruments come out at the other, ready for use. And of course, with sterilization or decontamination of PPE, there is always the danger of it being introduced at a stage when you've basically got highly contaminated material potentially mixing with very clean disinfected material, and that's something that we looked very closely at when we developed our guidance note on certainly utilization of hydrogen peroxide processes for decontaminating certainly the respirator masks that were in very great short supply during the initial stages of the pandemic. And our regulatory authority were adamant that these devices should not be reprocessed in a sterile processing department. So we sort of had a brainstorming session to think, well, would it be possible to create some kind of decontamination area in another part of the hospital where you could have appropriately trained people reprocessing these individual items in a freestanding decontamination unit, such as a hydrogen peroxide sterilizer, rather than actually doing it in the SPD department itself. So it was just trying to think outside of the box without actually compromising the workflow of a regulated sterile processing department.
If I may add, it's interesting because when we were reprocessing, it's hard to know what to use to describe what we did with our N95 respirators in the sterile processing department. When we got emergency use authorization from the FDA, that we could send our used PPE, mostly the N95s, the procedure masks, surgical masks, didn't live up to being reprocessed anyway, from my experience. And we were challenged initially because we were trying to figure out, number one, we can't clean the respirators, so that was an issue. And then we had to write people's names and department on it and so forth. But I think during that crisis period, it kept some of the SPD staff working, but at the same time, when the OR was virtually shut down except to emergency or urgent procedures. So there was that balance there, you know, because financially we weren't doing procedures, but we were reprocessing the N95 respirators and keeping some of the SPD staff working during this time. And so where we are today, the FDA has removed the emergency use authorization for decontamination of these N95 respirators. And so we are back to that conventional strategies. But what we're faced with now with this surge, we're getting asked a lot of questions around, are we going to have to go back to reusing the N95s like we did when we were in that crisis phase of the pandemic? And at this point, I think we're good because the manufacturers of N95, I think they're better prepared moving forward now to address the issues around N95. So we are not looking to have our SPD having to reprocess N95s anymore. And I don't
Do you
know.
think, I was going to say, do you think that that whole issue has now gone away? It sounds as if you're suggesting it has, that the supply industry has caught up and now has the capacity to supply whatever is needed. I do agree with you. Come autumn, autumn will be a testing time for the UK, when it's very traditional to have a lot of respiratory disease present in the population. And that will include COVID. So it'd be interesting to see if the supply chain can cope should we get another surge in hospitalizations, although I think our government is hoping that the vaccination program will prevent a massive surge in patients requiring hospital treatment.
Well, you know, Brian, I think from the UK perspective, I think the population there is very compliant because it seems that you've got high vaccination numbers, at least into the first dose. And I'm sure most are into their second doses of vaccine. So that's the push here. And I think from the perspective of the N95s, for example, I'm hoping that manufacturers now have a supply chain that can be maintained and prevent interruptions, having the FDA to reissue any kind of emergency use authorization. But we were also having issues around isolation gowns as well and surgical gowns. So, you know, because there were areas that wanted to use surgical gowns, not just your regular isolation gowns. So I think we are at a good point right now where we can say that things are fairly stable. But I say that with some hesitation that hopefully the vaccine will catch up. So as you said, Brian, that we won't have as many hospitalizations to deal with.
I think, Jackie, Brian, what we have to keep an eye out for now post-pandemic is the demand that the healthcare infrastructure is going to impose on the supply chain by other means, knowing that many facilities across the world ramped down surgeries and manufacturing plants equally ramped down. Now, all of a sudden, everyone's wanting to catch up on surgeries, are going to put a big demand on the same products on the supply chain, which is why I think similar to sterilization wrap and similar to our recent, I see FDA's added the recent supply shortage on the light blue sodium citrate blood tubes and other things such as the masks, other plastics, disposable shops containers. With things happening, I think we're going to see other products now and other supply shortages start happening. And I feel that this may be another year of various products going on supply shortages. So I think post-pandemic life is going to be different in terms of supply chain disruptions for other products that we don't foresee. Now, some of these products I mentioned are related in terms of perhaps the plastic grade that they use, but it's certainly going to be something to watch for. because ramping up and catching up on wait lists is going to be strategies that most organizations are going to be deploying. However, the demand or the impacts on the supply chain is something that needs to be considered.
Well,
I
Gary,
think you're absolutely right. Sorry, yep. I think you're absolutely right, Gary. The fact that it's not only the manufacturing sites that are experiencing problems, but also the logistics of shipping finished items around the world. Many items are shipped from China, and there are issues with shipping containers and slots on the large vessels that transport these containers around. There are issues with, in the UK at the minute, there are issues with heavy goods vehicle drivers. There are not enough HGV drivers to be able to drive these heavy lorries to the delivery points. So it's not just the manufacturing of the devices, it's the getting them to the point of use that is creating problems at the minute as well.
I think, Gary, I have to say that I admire your optimism by saying post-pandemic. We're never going to get to post-pandemic. And I agree with you both that there are shortages that the domino effects of this pandemic has produced. And you name it, there's a shortage. For example, we were even having shortage with copier papers during this pandemic. So again, I agree with you both that the post-crisis pandemic is what I would say, because I think we are still heavily into the pandemic, and I don't know if we'll ever get out of it if we don't get 100% vaccination across the world, because there are underserved areas on this planet that have limited or no access to vaccines. So there's that to contend with. And while all that is going on, other pathogens are rearing their heads. Monkeypox, for example, is another one that's popping up. And with the opening of America, where everyone took their mask and threw them off like graduation caps, we're now seeing huge increases in the viral respiratory illnesses that we would normally see in the winter, like RSV and rhinovirus, and some of the enteroviruses have gone through the roof. So what this showed us all in the end is that masking is extremely important. So yeah, that's where we are. We might run short of just procedure masks.
Protected.
So I think we're at the end of our question and answer. I'd like to thank everyone for attending, and it was great catching up on this pandemic and having Dr. Kirk and Dr. Bassey to speak with us. So thank you, everyone, and enjoy your day and the weekend. Goodbye.
Thank
for
you.
now.
Bye now.